the mass media, violence and the amplification of deviance. This is page 287 in the textbook. Alright, so we looked last time at different models that are to do with the effects and uses of the mass media. Now, one of the biggest effects is that you can have this amplification of deviance, okay, where something is blown out of all proportion because it suits the media to put it that way. So let's see what we have to say about this. As we have seen, the hypodermic syringe model claims that exposure to the mass media can directly influence or even determine the behaviour of individuals in society. From this point of view, one specific concern has always been the portrayal of deviance and violence in particular, with the assumption that the portrayal of violence in the media can lead to violence in society. Following incidents of mass killings such as those at Hungerford and Dunblane in the United Kingdom and Columbine in the USA, a search usually begins to look for the cause of these incidents by finding out about viewing habits of the perpetrators. Okay, Hungerford was a guy called Michael Ryan who went on the loose with a machine gun, I think, and I do believe that the first person he killed was his mother, and he then went and killed about 15 other people. Hungerford is just a small town in Berkshire in the UK, so it was, it was a major shock to everybody. Dunblane was a guy who went into a school and killed a group of 7 and 8 year olds and their teacher whilst they were in a gym lesson, and as a result of that lots of schools added security to try and stop something like that happening again, and afterwards there were questions as to why it was that this had happened, and I mean there are many reasons. However, as far as I recall, the main reason for it, I can't think what the man's name was, and maybe that's a good thing. The main reason for it was that the guy had, he wanted to run a scout company, and he'd been rejected because when they ran a check on him, it didn't seem like he was very secure, and obviously that was right, and it seemed to be the thing that just kind of tipped him over the edge. And then he went and took it out on a group of young innocent children. Dunblane is just a small area in Scotland, and as a result of it in the community, there's therefore an age group that's missing, or very small, because he took out the children at that school. Columbine is a high school in America. Where 2 boys went in and shot a group of students. They were particularly looking for the sporty people, and they left behind 2 videos which basically said they'd been rejected by other people, and this was their revenge. The murder of 2-year-old James Bolger in 1993 is also strongly linked to the similarity between his young murderer's acts and those depicted in the film Child's Play 3. This had been rented by one of the boy murderers in the weeks prior to the murder, and the judge in the subsequent trial made reference to his suspicion that exposure to violent films may in part be an explanation. The Jamie Bolger case was horrible. 2 10-year-old boys who took away a small boy who was around 2.5, Jamie Bolger. He got separated from his mum, walked away from his mum, they took him away, CCTV cameras saw him, which actually comforted his mother when she saw the footage, because she thought they were young boys and they would look after him. Instead they dragged him away, he was crying, he was seen by other people. The boys said that they were looking after him, taking him home to his mum if anyone asked them, and in fact they took him down to a train line, they physically abused him, and they tied him to the train tracks, and he boys who was killed. A particularly nasty story, a particularly nasty event, change people's attitudes in the UK, because the idea is that 10-year-olds can't be held responsible for their behaviour. In the trial, it was suggested that they'd watched Child's Play 3, and this is what had given them the ideas. Interestingly, I also remember at the time them showing some videos of the two boys, and they're at a party, and one of them, they're playing a game, and he pushes another child off of a chair, and psychologists were looking at it and saying, oh, why didn't anybody see this? He's already got violent tendencies and all this type of thing. But it's easy with foresight to look at these things and see that lots of children push each other off of chairs. Lots of children, lots of adults watch violent things. It doesn't mean they go out and commit acts of violence. So we have to kind of weigh this up very carefully. The film director Stanley Kubrick withdrew copies of the film A Clockwork Orange after repeated claims that the film was causing incidents of copycat violence. Now, again, I've read the book A Clockwork Orange. I don't think I've watched the film, but it didn't incite me to go out and commit violence. I would like to think that I'm, intelligent enough not to think that I need to go out and copy what I've read in a book. So many attempts have been made to show a causal link between the media and social violence, often by use of the experimental method. Among the best known of these is that carried out by Bandura in an experiment where children were shown 3 clips of televised images of inflated dolls being attacked. In the first case, the attackers were punished, and in the second they were rewarded, and in the third nothing happened. When encouraged to play with dolls themselves, it was the children who had seen the attackers punished who were least likely to imitate what they had seen on television, while children from the other groups were more likely to attack the dolls. Similarly, Liebert and Barron found that children exposed to television violence were more likely to hurt other children than those who hadn't been exposed. Okay, now just notice the language there, more likely, okay, who were least likely to imitate. That doesn't mean that all of them did it, only some of them did it, okay. And this is always the issue here, and again, these are experiments, and therefore we have to question, are people behaving differently because they're in a different environment as well. Such studies will always be vulnerable to the criticisms made of experiments that they are artificial and at best can only demonstrate short-term effects. Belson's research on the 1,565 boys attempted to look at the long-term effects of exposure to television violence. In doing this, he differentiated between different contexts and portrayals of violence. For example, gratuitous and non-gratuitous violence in television drama, or that in cartoons and comedy. Where violence does have an effect, he found, it is where boys have a high exposure to violence, particularly portrayals in film and drama, although cartoons were seen as having little effect. High exposure to television violence increases the degree to which boys engage in serious violence. Steps should be taken as soon as possible to achieve a substantial reduction in the total amount of violence being presented on television. Now, we know that in fact the amount of amount of violence presented on television is rising and rising, and we can go on the internet and watch violence whenever we want if that's what we choose to watch. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that violence is increasing all around in society. If you watch The Simpsons, Itchy and Scratchy is extremely violent. And yet Bart and Lisa laugh at it. They don't perceive it in the sense of the badness of it. They find it amusing. Right now, we could say that that's desensitizing them to things. But again, it's presented in a cartoon version. So is it different when we see that sort of thing happening? And of course, the thing with cartoons is that although violence may happen to characters, they pop back up to life again. If you ever watched Roadrunner cartoons with Wile E. Coyote gets steamrollered, run over, dragged along behind a car, whatever it might happen to be, and then he just pops back up again and he's fine. So that understanding of violence is different, and it's saying here that in cartoons that doesn't have such an effect on people. As we've said before, in fact what it could do is have the opposite effect as well and move people away from violence. So Belson's work has also been widely criticised. For example, in his assertion that heavy exposure to any form of television, violent or not, increases the propensity to violence in children. Similarly, those boys with the highest propensity to violence were not the heaviest television watchers, but only moderate viewers. The heaviest viewers were not the most likely to be the most violent. His research was also based on asking the boys to remember television programs they might have seen up to 12 years before, when they were in their infancy. As Murdoch and McCrone argue, his use of adults to judge the level of violence in television programs did not allow an exploration of the boys' perception of violence on television. He also looked at the boys individually and not as members of gangs and subcultures, ignoring their social experience and background. Okay, so we can see the criticisms here. I think they're all fairly obvious. In attempting to understand the effects of mediated violence, the concepts of disinhibition and desensitization have been developed. Disinhibition refers to the consequences of becoming increasingly familiar with televised violence, such that it becomes commonplace and even acceptable in society. Desensitization refers to the way that continuous exposure to mediated violence ceases to have a shock effect on viewers, leaving program makers looking for ever more graphic and gruesome portrayals. Okay, now, just recently, today, as I was driving home from school, there was a news report that Facebook has removed a clip of a woman being decapitated or beheaded, and Facebook said they'd put it on there because they wanted people to condemn it, but today they've vowed to pressure, and they've removed it because people thought that it was degrading and it wasn't an appropriate thing to put on there. Now yes, we do have more and more graphic things within society, but that also suggests that there is a line, and people know when that line has been crossed and are prepared to speak up and say something. Okay, whereas this desensitization would suggest that there is no line because gradually it's being eroded all the time. So critics such as Martin Barker, however, are highly skeptical of this argument, observing that firefighters and medical staff become desensitized after attending traffic accidents over a number of years, but retain a sensitivity and desire to help the victims. Okay, so this is kind of taking it a step further. I'm not sure that medical staff and firefighters do become desensitized. If they see something, really horrible, it can still have a huge effect on them. So we have to consider this. It may also be the case that the opposite happens, that the mass media sensitizes people to violence and help prevent its occurrence in society. Oh, I could have written this book. Certainly, live pictures of the war in Vietnam beamed into people's homes in the USA contributed to the anti-war movement there, and the reporting of war has been carefully considered by governments and the media ever since. Similarly, news stories concerning violent crime, particularly against children, encourages the public to contact television programs such as Crime Watch and report information to the police. Mediated violence, according to Gunter and McAleer, may have a cathartic effect, allowing the potentially violent to release those emotions when watching violence rather than carrying it out in their own lives. Okay, so here we're seeing the positive sides to having violence on TV or in a book, because then people live it out through that as opposed to actually going and doing those things. As with research into the general effects of the mass media, studies of the relationship between television and violence are inconclusive, incurring similar methodological problems. Looking specifically at young people, Hagel and Newburn argue that those who blame the mass media for crime or on a doomed mission in search of a simple solution to a complex problem. No informed person can simply say that TV is bad or that it is good for children. For some children under some conditions, or for the same children under other conditions, it may be beneficial. For most children under most conditions, most TV is probably neither particularly harmful nor particularly beneficial. Okay, so we're back to these very vague statements that we've heard before. Do you remember the one that we had before from Professor Berelson, who said some kinds of communication on some kinds of issues brought to the attention of some kinds of people under some kinds of conditions have some kinds of effects? Yeah? Okay, so we're getting the same thing. This is a complex issue. We can't say it's due to one thing. There are lots of things that are causing this, and if we're foolish enough to say it's TV, we have to acknowledge that for some people TV is good and for other people it's bad, and on different days it's the opposite, and you know, we can't just draw one simple conclusion. Other writers studying violence in the media have identified other roles played by the mass media. One frequently observed discovery is that the mass media can increase the focus on or amplify the extent of deviance in society to a point where the public's fear of crime is greater than the reality of the crime itself. Okay, so they are generating a fear amongst people. In creating an awareness of particular crimes and types of deviance, the mass media can also promote and extend deviance, an amplification spiral, as well as play an organising role for the containment of such behaviour. Okay, so remember before we read about mugging, okay, and how the media put that forward. All right, so let's just think now very quickly about the mods and rockers. So one of the best known sociological analysis of this effect can be found in Stan Cohen's Folk Devils and Moral Panics. A moral panic occurs when a condition, episode, person or group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. When the moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians and other right-thinking people, socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnoses and solutions, ways of coping are evolved or, more often, resorted to. A moral panic can occur at any time and can even involve the re-emergence of a forgotten issue. It begins with the identification of a social problem or deviant group and follows a predictable pattern in which the mass media plays a central part. Okay, now notice that they also talk about other people getting involved here, not just editors, but bishops, so the church steps in and makes comments, politicians will step in, maybe they will start certain social policies to go with this, okay? So it's not just the media, but they can play a big part in amplifying what is going on. But at the same time, they can also play a big part in controlling what is going on, stopping these things from happening. So the folk devils of this title are the mods and rockers of the 1960s. Cohen points out that small seaside town disturbances, which became associated with these groups, had been common since the late 1950s. Why then did a few isolated scuffles between gangs of youths at that point turn into a wide-scale moral panic, spreading new fashions, music and images of gang warfare into the living rooms and school playgrounds of Britain? Easter 1964 was cold and wet, and groups of youths in Clacton were bored. They rode up and down the streets on their scooters and bikes, wrecked a few beach huts and broke some windows. There were fights and crowds in the streets. The Monday papers, starved of news after the holiday period, seized upon the events as news, and the following headlines appeared: Day of Terror by Scooter Groups. Youngsters beat up town, 97 leather jacket arrests. Wild Ones invade seaside, 97 arrests. Old people and respectable families of holidaymakers were often reported as being intimidated by the fighting youths. According to Cohen's research into local press and eyewitness reports, this intimidation rarely took place. Deserted beaches were empty, not because of the fear of violence, but because of the bad weather. In fact, those holidaymakers who did turn out did so to watch the fighting. Okay, so Cohen's research finds a completely opposite picture to what the newspapers are saying. By making predictions about what might happen next through the symbolisation of the youth cultures as dangerous and deviant, and by exaggerating the scale of the problem, the mass media, Cohen argues, contributed to the labelling of a deviant group and the creation of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They helped sustain a moral panic they had helped to create, with the clear implication that the problem would be insignificant and would probably disappear without saturation media coverage. Okay, so because the media made it a big event, this problem was perpetuated. It wouldn't have been if they'd have just stopped commenting on it and drawing other people in to get their ideas and opinions and whatever else. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because they labelled these people as being deviant, as being violent, as having a hatred of one another, and then they pushed and pushed and pushed at it so that it actually started to happen. The prospect of further violence on public holidays became the subject of continuous media speculation, with reporters and journalists sent to seaside towns to cover any possible events. Any activity was seized on as newsworthy, and it became the ambition of some young people to see their own photos in the papers the next day. More police were sent to cover the next public holiday, and there were more mods, rockers and innocent bystanders, leading to more arrests and more media coverage. As Cohen remarks, if one is in a group of 20 being stared at by hundreds of adults and being pointed at by 2 or 3 cameras, the temptation to do something, even if only to shout an obscenity, make a rude gesture or throw a stone, is very great, and made greater by the knowledge that one's actions will be recorded for others to see. So, here we are. Here Cohen is making this comment that, they're being pushed into these things, okay? And, we all know the temptation sometimes when someone's watching you and they're expecting you to do something. You think, why not? Oh, I might become famous. I might be on the telly if I do this type of thing. Yeah. So again, it was the media pushing these things. In contributing to the amplification spiral in this way, the mass media also help articulate the formation of a control culture, whose role is to encourage politicians, judges and other agencies to punish the newly identified folk devils, in much the same way that vigilante groups would hunt out witches. In this way, the forces of discipline and surveillance become strengthened and gain new resources with which to fight a distorted and enlarged enemy. An adequate medium of communication must be present for spreading the hostile belief and mobilising potential participants. Okay, so this control culture then becomes politicians, judges, sometimes teachers maybe, who are drafted in to say this is the way we're going to deal with these things, this is the way we're going to teach people to behave in the future, this is how people are going to be punished. Alright. The study of moral panics, a phrase initiated by Cohen, though the phrase deviancy amplification is taken from Wilkins, is now well researched, and there is a considerable literature concerning the process of deviancy amplification, for example Hall and Atkinson, to the extent that a periodization of their study has been proposed by Munsey. Thus, those of the 1950s and early 1960s are described as discrete, and later 1960s are diffuse, and the 1970s and 1980s generalized. Okay, so discrete is as in pertaining to specific groups. Diffuse, it starts to move out a bit more, and then by the 80s generalized, so again, looking at large groups and making suppositions. Cohen's important study clearly owes much to the interactionist tradition and should be examined alongside the sociology of deviance generated by this perspective. His emphasis on the process of labelling and the self-fulfilling prophecy clearly owes much to Becker, and Mert's claim that social control leads to deviance forms one of the central premises of the book. One of Cohen's main contributions to this tradition has been to incorporate and highlight the role of the mass media in these processes. The student of moral enterprise cannot but pay particular attention to the role of the mass media in defining and shaping social problems. Okay, so Cohen obviously sees the mass media as being important, but it is important to understand that he's looking at this from an interactionist perspective. Okay, and he's saying, you know, what made people do these things and why did they react to each other in these ways? And then he can see, you know, the influence of the mass media. Critics of Cohen's work, for example McRobbie, point out that the role of the audience is assumed rather than evidenced, as Cohen carried out minimal research in this area, looking at letters to the press, parliamentary debates, and conducting interviews with some members of the public. As Cohen acknowledges, the media may have little influence in creating primary deviance, and they cannot cause it to happen. It is still unclear how far they contribute to the creation of secondary deviance, and from this point of view, his work is subject to the criticisms made in general of the interactionist view of crime and deviance. Okay, now you've got primary and secondary deviance. Okay, primary deviance is where I may choose to do something wrong as a result of an incident that's happened to me. But secondary deviance is when I am pushed into something by somebody else. So a peer may encourage me to do something deviant. I don't want to, but they say, go on, I've done it before, or you know, you're a chicken if you don't do this. Okay, so you're influenced on by someone else. And Cohen is saying, all right, we can't prove that mass media may be cause primary deviancy, but when you get a group of people together and they start, you know, considering things in different ways and saying, did you see how that was shown on TV or portrayed or whatever else, that then can lead to the violence that he is talking about. Okay. However, McRobbie is saying, you know, he doesn't actually check the role of the audience. He just assumes, you know, what it is that people do as a result of watching violence on TV.